All right, let's go ahead and start. Let's put phones away. Anybody have questions about the paper before we get started?
When are we getting the other ones back?
We're working on it. As soon as we have the stack back, we'll post the grades. As soon as we have the stack completed, we'll post the grades, and then you'll know that they're coming back. In the meantime, you can come see us, and we'll look over yours with you if you want. The final version of it due on Monday, April 23rd. Is that what it is? So, yeah, we're working on it. How far along do you think we are, Vanessa? By Tuesday, okay. All right, that's the goal then. We'll hand them back on Tuesday if we can. I've got office hours right after class today. If anybody has specific concerns, although most of the papers are on Vanessa's desk at the moment. So, but I can pull it up on Blackboard and we can look it over together if anybody wants to come by. Okay, so our focus today is free speech, and one of the things about studying the freedom of speech, of course, is that free speech disputes usually arise when somebody is attempting to communicate something that is controversial in some way, often offensive, or other advocating some unpopular ideas or expressing some kind of ideas in some kind of offensive or unpopular way. Because if you're just saying something pretty normal and routine and uncontroversial, usually your freedom of speech does not wind up getting suppressed, right? There might be exceptions. Anyway, many free speech disputes emerge from people saying something controversial or otherwise unpopular. And so I want to show you a couple, before we talk about these cases, I want to show you some images from some of the cases that we're going to talk about. Some of these images are offensive or upsetting or hateful or otherwise disturbing. But we're going to talk about the cases. We got to see what's going on. So here's one. We actually talked about flag burning earlier in the semester. There was a flag burning case from the 1960s after James Meredith got shot. Mr. Sidney Street, I think it was, in Brooklyn, pulled his American flag out of his dresser, walked outside in the street and burned it, and got arrested. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor in that case, but they did not address the main First Amendment issue of does the First Amendment protect your right to burn the American flag? And so that issue came back to the Supreme Court in the 1980s and 90s in two cases that we'll take a look at. The Supreme Court has also heard a couple cases involving cross burning, right? Public burning of a large Christian cross, which in American history has usually been intended to convey a message of white supremacy and a message intended to terrify African Americans in particular. There have been multiple Supreme Court cases trying to figure out whether the First Amendment protects your right to do that. This is from a case in the 80s, probably, hopefully. The text is too small for you to actually read from where you're sitting. This is an ad. It's a parody of an ad. It appeared in Hustler magazine. I mean, it is an ad. It's an ad for Campari liquor that appeared in Hustler magazine, which is a pornographic magazine. And it was parodying I guess it's a parody of an ad for Campari liquor, right? So Campari had an ad campaign, like remember the first time that you tried Campari, or something like that. I don't know, this is a long time ago, the 80s. Anyway, this is Jerry Falwell, this guy, who was a well-known evangelical Christian preacher who had a TV show, right? He would preach on TV on Sunday mornings and had millions of followers, pre-social media, right? So it's all just television. And he was also he was very politically active. He was a prominent supporter of President Reagan. He was one of the founders of a group called the Moral Majority, which was one of the earliest kind of organized groups that was part of the religious right, exerting an active influence in American politics. So Jerry Falwell is a prominent conservative public figure, religious figure, and this, the parody in the text of this ad describes him having sex with his mother. Right? It's the most offensive thing you could possibly come up with, right? So that's that. Do you have does the First Amendment protect your right to print that in a magazine? Right? Here's another one that's a somewhat similar issue in some ways, but more recent. This is members of the Westboro Baptist Church, which is based in Kansas, but the members of this church, I don't know if they're still doing this, but for a while they were regularly driving around the country and conducting protests like this outside of military funerals. So this is the funeral for Marine Lance Corporal Matthew Snyder, who was killed in combat in Iraq. Does the First Amendment protect your right to do that? And then this one, this is maybe less offensive. I guess this is offensive to some people too. So this is outside of a public school in Alaska. It's during school hours, but they're obviously not in school. They're on a public sidewalk. The Olympic torch was going through town and passing by. So the principal said, at 10 o'clock or whatever, everybody in school is going to go outside on the sidewalk. We're going to have, we can cheer for the Olympic torch when it goes by. And these folks pulled that banner out of their backpack or whatever and unfurled it and held it up for the TV cameras, and the principal came over and confiscated it, and the kid who had brought it got suspended. Do you have a First Amendment right to display that banner at a school-sanctioned event during school hours? I think that's all my images. Okay. So, we'll take these kind of one at a time. I guess by way of introduction, I will say there's lots of different kinds of free speech disputes. One kind of free speech dispute is disputes about, it's more than one kind, maybe, but they sort of go together in some ways. Disputes about offensive or outrageous expression, right? It's not the only kind of free speech dispute, right? There's free speech disputes about, leaking national security secrets, right? That's a different issue, right? But there's disputes that are about when can the government suppress offensive or outrageous expression, right? You could also think of pornography and obscenity disputes in that context as well. And there have been some, I'll talk about some of those cases. There's been a number of those in recent years too, in particular regarding the regulation of pornography online. So one of the things, so we talked about free speech during the Warren Court era, right? Some of you wrote about it in your Warren Court papers. And the basic trend during the Warren Court era is it became much more protective of freedom of speech than it had been previously, right? The court during World War I and the Cold War was not protective of anti-war speech at all, but then during the Vietnam War, the court started to protect anti-war speech more actively, right? So just significant expansion. And the court in the 60s seemed willing to extend this expansion to a wide variety of different kinds of speech, right? So we talked about, for example, New York Times versus Sullivan, which involved an advertisement that was placed by supporters of Dr. King. We also talked about Brandenburg versus Ohio, which was about a Klan rally, right? And in both of those cases, the court held that the First Amendment protected the speech, right? So one was advocacy of racial equality, one was opposition to racial equality. Both of them are protected by the First Amendment, according to the court in the 1960s. Some of those decisions in the 1960s were unanimous, but not all of them. And in many cases, the dynamic on the court was that it was the relatively more liberal justices on the court who were expanding the protection of freedom of speech, and it was the relatively more conservative justices who were sometimes dissenting. That's an oversimplification, but that was the basic dynamic in the 60s. That is still true in some kinds of free speech cases. But in some of the cases I want to call our attention to today, some of the cases I want to call our attention to today, that is not really the dynamic. The dynamic is that all of the justices, or almost all of the justices, are ruling in favor of freedom of speech. Or sometimes the court is still divided, but it's not really divided liberals versus conservatives. There's 5 justices, or however many, that are a mix of liberals and conservatives that are all defending the freedom of speech. And there's some other group of justices, 4 or fewer, that's a mix of liberals and conservatives who are arguing that speech should be restricted in this context, right? So take the Hustler magazine case to start. So that's the one about Jerry Falwell. There's a movie that's focused on this case. It is a little dated now, but there's a movie called The People versus Larry Flynt. Larry Flynt was the publisher of Hustler magazine. Woody Harrelson plays him in the movie. And it talks about his life and his founding and leadership of this pornographic magazine, and it focuses a lot on this famous Supreme Court case that he was involved in. So Jerry Falwell was a famous critic of pornography, right? One of the political causes that Jerry Falwell advocated was that we should have greater governmental restrictions on obscene and pornographic speech, right? These magazines should not be so widely available. There's no internet back then, it's just magazines. And so Larry Flynt, who believed everybody had a First Amendment right to produce and possess and distribute and read sexually explicit material, right? He had lots of disagreements with Jerry Falwell, right? And so it's out of those disagreements that this fake Campari ad is published in his magazine, and Jerry Falwell sues the magazine. Right? He goes to court. He files a lawsuit. The legal term for what Jerry Falwell was suing for is intentional infliction of emotional distress, which is the exact same thing that a couple decades later Matthew Snyder's family sues for. Right? When the Westboro Baptist Church protests outside their son's funeral with offensive signs, they sue the members of that church who were protesting for intentional infliction of emotional distress. That's the same thing that Jerry Falwell sues for. So there's some complicated technical legal details about what exactly does that mean, but the gist of it is it's sort of like a libel or defamation suit, right? If somebody publishes something that harms your reputation, right, publishes something false about you that harms your reputation, you can sue them for defamation. This is a similar idea, it's just a different legal thing that you're suing for, right? If somebody publishes or publicly displays something that intentionally inflicts emotional distress upon you, you can sue them for that. And so that's what Jerry Falwell does. And of course, Larry Flynt and his lawyers reply that you can't punish us for intentionally inflicting emotional distress on this guy for publishing this ad, because that would violate the First Amendment. Right? And that's what the court has to decide. And the case goes to the Supreme Court. And Larry Flynt wins. Hustler magazine wins unanimously, if memory serves, with the opinion written by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who is one of the court's most conservative judges. So this case is as good a sign as any, as this is the late 80s, right? What we have going on at the moment here is not really a dispute between liberal and conservative justices, right? All of the justices say that the First Amendment applies here, this speech is protected, and one of the most conservative justices writes the opinion. Chief Justice Rehnquist says, at the heart of the First Amendment is the recognition of the fundamental importance of the free flow of ideas and opinions on matters of public interest and concern. The sort of robust political debate encouraged by the First Amendment is bound to produce speech that is critical of those who hold public office or those public figures, etc., etc. This is where, like, if you are Jerry Falwell, you interrupt and you're like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, robust public debate on matters of important concern? Really? Is that what that was doing? At first glance, that is not really what it looks like is going on in Hustler magazine. But Chief Justice Rehnquist says, look, I know it's offensive. I know it's outrageous. I know it goes over the line for many people's sense of taste and decency. But Jerry Falwell was a public figure. He is a famous person who is on TV all the time, right? Engaged in political debate, including calling for the outlawing of this very magazine, right? He's not just a private person minding his business. He is a public figure engaged in public debate. We have a long history, Chief Justice Rehnquist says, of political cartoons in this country. He describes some published political cartoons that were published about, like, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, which are pretty bad, right? They're pretty offensive. Some of them are sexualized, right? They're making stuff up, saying true stuff or rumors or whatever about these politicians' personal, private sex lives back in the 18th century, right? There is a long history of this. It stretches the boundaries of taste and decency, but it is protected by the First Amendment, right? I'm not saying private people, right? That would potentially be different. You just publishing something like this about your neighbor who's totally minding his own business. That might be different. But a public figure, somebody who has put himself or herself into the public eye, under the First Amendment, they're subject to caustic public commentary. Yeah.
What was the argument for Falwell's lawyers? Was it just is there something in the Constitution that says you can't be harmed?
No, but I mean, so like with every free speech, right? I mean, if you read the text of the First Amendment, it sounds like it's absolute. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, and then over time the court says that applies to the state governments too. Justice Black used to say make no law means make no law. It's absolute, but most lawyers and judges are like, it can't really be absolute, right? So then you have a question of line drawing, right? And so remember back to our discussion of the cases from the 50s and 60s. There's basically two ways to draw lines in a First Amendment dispute. You could say there are some types of speech that are protected and some types that aren't. That's one way to do it, right? First Amendment's about, like, core political speech, right? Standing on the street corner, urging your fellow citizens to vote for somebody, right? Or writing a letter to the editor, urging your fellow citizens to vote for somebody. But it's not about pornography on the internet, right? Some kinds of speech are protected, some kinds of speech are not protected. Lawyers call that the categorical approach to the First Amendment. There's some categories that are protected, some categories are not. So Jerry Falwell's lawyers are like, this is just not protected, right? It's just outside the scope of the First Amendment. There's no redeeming social value to this at all. It's blatantly offensive. It's not saying anything true about any, right? I mean, it's not really it says, you couldn't see this on the screen, but in really small letters at the bottom, it says ad parody, something like that. And so it's not even purporting. I don't think most readers would read it as purporting to make factual claims about Jerry Falwell, right? It's making fun of Jerry Falwell in an offensive way to call attention to some of his positions that we disagree with, right? So Falwell's lawyers are like, that's unprotected. The other way to do it is to say, well, every kind of speech is potentially protected, but case by case we got to look at, well, how important is the free speech here and how important is the government's interest in suppressing it, and we got to balance them against each other. So there, Jerry Falwell's lawyers will be like, this speech is not that important. And protecting people against scurrilous, outrageous, offensive criticism is more important than a stupid ad parody like this, right? But neither one of those arguments works, right? The Supreme Court says it's protected, right? It's protected. We know it's offensive. We know it's offensive. But it's still protected. So 20-some years later, in 2011, the Westboro Baptist Church case comes to the court. And it's a really similar issue, right? I mean, the facts are different, but legally it's a pretty similar issue. Highly offensive speech, right? In an even more offensive, context, right? It is outside somebody's funeral, right? Where his family and friends are there to try to celebrate and memorialize his life. And across the street, they didn't disrupt the funeral or anything. It's peaceful. It's just standing there with signs. It's across the street. But highly offensive communication via signs. I don't know if they were chanting or anything too. I think it was mostly quiet and peaceful. It's just the signs. And the legal thing, the lawsuit that's filed is the same type of law, right? Intentional infliction of emotional distress, filed by Matthew Snyder's father. And similar thing happens, right? They win in court initially in the state courts, and they get a judgment where Fred Phelps and the other members of Westboro Baptist Church are going to have to pay a hefty judgment to them. But Fred Phelps' lawyers say, no, this violates the First Amendment, right? You can't force us to pay money for having this peaceful political protest, just like you can't force Larry Flynt to pay money for publishing an ad parody in his magazine, no matter how offensive it might be. And they make their way to the Supreme Court, and they win too. And that one's 8-1, so not quite unanimous, but very nearly unanimous. And the opinion is written by Chief Justice Roberts, who is the guy who succeeded Chief Justice Rehnquist, and is also one of the court's most conservative judges, right? So it's 8-1, so it's not about liberals versus conservatives here. It's all of the justices, in this case almost all of the justices, saying that the First Amendment protects this kind of thing, right? No matter how offensive it might be, right? They are, at some level, trying to communicate something, and the government is trying to silence them, right, on the basis of the ideas that they are communicating, right? The ideas that they are communicating are insane, right? God is punishing the United States for allowing gays and lesbians to openly serve in the military, and therefore, it is these dead. I mean, one of the signs said, "Thank God for dead soldiers," right? I mean, insanity, right? But at some level, Robert says, though all of us disagree with what they're trying to say, at some level they are trying to say something, and the government is trying to punish them for the ideas that they are trying to convey. And the government is not allowed to do that under the First Amendment. What do you think of these two cases? Yeah.
I kind of agree. I think it's, a lot of them are reprehensible, but, I think the moment you start to restrict freedom of speech, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So I think it's important that, despite it might not be a popular opinion, to err on the side of freedom of speech rather than restricting it.
One argument that's often made in First Amendment cases is the slippery slope, which is just a metaphor. It's an image that you're you start going down a hill, but it's slippery, it's icy or whatever, and you start sliding down further than you meant to, right? And so if you say, well, this one, come on, of course they can't protest outside people's funerals with these highly offensive signs. We allow them to suppress that. But then the next year another case is going to come along that's going to be something a little different, and you might say, okay, well, that one too, you might allow them to suppress that. And the idea is going to be you're going to have trouble slowing that train once it's going.
I can't remember if we talked about it last semester or if it was a different class, but I think we had talked about a case where you're not allowed to like incite people for violence. So like, as much as it sucks, like for Westboro, it's like a crappy situation. But like, they're not saying like go out and kill soldiers.
Yeah.
They're trying to incite a mob to actually kill soldiers. It stinks, but like there's like ways to counter it as well, which has been recent, like lining the streets in front of them. So
Sure. Yep.
But they're not. They're on public property and they're making a statement. And I think it's allowed.
Yeah. So incitement is a particular category, I guess, of expression that the court has tried to grapple with, right? So just like obscenity is a particular category of expression, where the court sometimes says obscenity is outside the scope of the First Amendment, but it's really hard to come up with a clear definition of what counts as obscenity, because like pictures of naked people can't be the definition, right? Because then you've got science textbooks and famous works of art and stuff, and so that's not. So then coming up with that real definition is really hard. So incitement's like another category where like if you are riling people up to immediately go engage in unlawful violent action directed against somebody, the government's allowed to punish you for that, prohibit you from doing that, the Supreme Court has said. But what exactly is our definition of incitement, right? Just given a speech that could theoretically someday influence somebody eventually to do something illegal, that's not what the court means, right? They're like, no. If you are directly riling somebody up to engage in immediate unlawful action, right, then that's one thing. But they're not doing that here. They're peacefully, I mean, obviously there's going to be some people really mad that might respond, could conceivably respond with violence, but that is not the intent of the, I don't know. That's, anyway, it's not, they're not calling for violence, right? So the court says it doesn't count as incitement, right? They're peaceful, they're non-disruptive, other than the content of the signs, which are of course disruptive, but they're not physically like intruding upon the funeral. They're not trying to enter the funeral home or the church or whatever. They're not trying to make loud noise to prevent the ceremony from occurring, right? All they are doing is displaying some words and images on signs. Yeah?
I was curious, in the Hustler case, if they hadn't put like ad parody on the bottom, do you think it would have changed to like a defamation of character? And do you think it could have gone like the other way?
So in a defamation lawsuit, so if you leave the first, what's that?
Would that be libel, I guess, if we were going to be specific?
Sure. So if you leave the First Amendment aside for a second and just figure out, like, oh, has somebody defamed me such that I can collect damages or not, right? Then you have to prove that they have published something that is false and that it damages your reputation. And so whether or not it says ad parody on the bottom, you would have to prove that folks reading it took it to be a statement of fact about you that was false and that harmed your reputation. And one could imagine a parody that doesn't actually say parody in so many words on the bottom, but that is clearly, nobody reading it thinks that is really an allegation that Jerry Falwell did those things, whether or not that word is. So that would be something that the judges would have to decide. And the word parody is an added help in deciding that, but its absence, they would still have to decide that.
Isn't it also very difficult with those kind of cases when someone is like, for better or worse, a public figure? I think like with an individual, like a private entities, it's a lot easier to prove that, but once you become like notorious in some manner, it's like they can just parody, its definition expands.
Well, what the court says, and this goes back to New York Times versus Sullivan, right, where that lawsuit was filed by an elected, like, county commissioner in Montgomery, Alabama, right, so he's an elected official. And what the court says is that, like, theoretically anybody can sue for libel, right? You could be somebody famous or you could be somebody that nobody ever heard of. Either case, it's possible that your reputation could be harmed by something that somebody publishes about you, and you could sue for libel. And the same basic standards, if all we're talking about is libel law, the same basic standards apply no matter who's suing. But the First Amendment, what they say in Sullivan, imposes some limits on that process, at least in the case of public officials, right? Because if you have a public official who is suing for libel because a newspaper published criticism of his official conduct as a public official, then I'm pretty sure you are now interfering with democratic discussion and debate about the performance of government, right? I mean, if Mayor Walsh does something I disagree with and I write a letter to the editor criticizing it, and then he sues me for libel because I've harmed his reputation, like, how is that democratic deliberation and discussion and debate, right, if a public official can do that? So the court says in Sullivan, whether or not, right, your reputation was harmed, right, whether or not something false was published about you, if you are a public official, right, an elected member of government, it would infringe the First Amendment if you were allowed to just go around suing everybody for libel and punishing them every time they criticize you. We're supposed to criticize you if you are an elected official. That is like a citizen's job to monitor. It is for sure the press's job, too, to monitor public officials and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and criticize them when they don't. So in Sullivan, that's about elected officials. In subsequent cases, the court repeatedly gets pulled to extend it to other kinds of famous people, right? The phrase shifts from public official to public figure, right? And so, like, if you are a celebrity who is in drug treatment or something, and somebody takes your picture, like, leaving the NA meeting, right, and then publishes it, and you are mad about it, like, the court's like, you're in the public eye. You put yourself in the public eye, right? We're not saying you should never be able to sue about anything, but the standard's got to be higher, right? You put yourself in the public eye. The public's interested in you. The press has the right to comment on you if it's a matter of public concern in some way, right? So the standards are different for private individuals and public figures. And over time, the court has expanded the scope of who counts as a public figure. Right, so Jerry Falwell is clearly a public figure. Right, doesn't hold elected office, but he's famous. He's on TV all the time. He put himself in the public eye. He's engaged in political debate. So the court's like, people got a right to talk about him, and if you got a right to talk about him under the First Amendment, you got a right to talk about him even in crazy, outrageous, offensive ways, because the First Amendment protects that. Remember the case about the guy wearing the jacket in the courtroom, right, during the Vietnam War, right? Obviously, you got a right to stand up and give a speech arguing that the Vietnam War is wrong and we should end U.S. involvement in it, right? That's one way to convey a message of opposition to the war. But there's another way to convey the similar message with 3 words that are very evocative, right? And you got a right to do that, right? Even though that's not the way some people would prefer you to communicate the message. First Amendment protects it. Think about flag burning. Right? Flag burning is offensive to many people. Right? Flag represents our country. Folks have fought in the military, right, to defend our nation's flag. Casting contempt on it by publicly burning it in the street is offensive to a great many people. It is also an effective way to communicate a political message, right? So this dispute, so we talked about a dispute in the 60s where as an African-American supporter of civil rights, a dispute in the 80s started, the Republican National Convention was in Texas somewhere, Dallas, or I forget, and somebody goes outside, somebody at a protest outside the Republican National Convention, right, burns an American flag in a clear effort to convey opposition to the agenda of the Republican Party that was currently holding the White House, right? George H.W. Bush was president. We don't like his agenda. We're going to call attention to our disagreements with him by burning this American flag. Does it successfully get some attention? I'm pretty sure it probably does. Right? Is it the only way to communicate your message and ideas? I'm sure probably not. Right? But the court says you got a First Amendment right to do it. Right? Texas had a law that said desecration of the American flag was illegal. Didn't just apply to burning, applied to other mistreatment of the flag too. And Gregory Lee Johnson, it was the 84 convention in Dallas, so Reagan was still president. Gregory Lee Johnson gets convicted and sentenced to a year in prison. And he makes his way to the Supreme Court, and he wins. The court throws out his conviction. Within less than a year, Congress passed a law, federal law, banning burning the American flag. It's called the Flag Protection Act, enacted in 1988, 89, somewhere in there. On the day that federal law goes into effect, right? So it's high profile national news, Congress by gigantic majorities, right? Almost everybody in Congress, both parties, votes for this law. On the day the law goes into effect, several civil liberties advocates go out on the steps of the Capitol in D.C. and they burn an American flag, right? For the obvious reason that they want to convey disagreement with this law, and also they want to provoke a legal challenge, right? So they get arrested, they get prosecuted, they challenge the law as unconstitutional, and they make it to the way to the Supreme Court, and they win too, right? Same issue, really. It's not like Texas can't do it, U.S. Congress can't do it either. First Amendment applies to both of them. And in the second case, the court adds on the argument. Basically, the arguments are the same in the two cases, but in the second case, the court also adds on. It's apparent to us, obviously, that our holding last year was controversial, right? Many people disagree with it, and the U.S. Congress has weighed in against it. Doesn't matter, right? First Amendment protects your right to express controversial ideas, no matter how unpopular that is. Does not matter how many people in Congress voted for that. We said it's protected by the First Amendment last year. It is still protected by the First Amendment this year. Doesn't matter. Right?
Question.
Yeah.
What punishment did Congress decide, and how did they come up with it?
I don't know how they came up with it. They did have prison terms in there and fines. I know the guy in Texas had been sentenced to a year in prison. I don't think that the ones who got arrested under the federal law never got convicted and sentenced. Right? They challenged it as on the day of arrest, and the court agreed to hear the case before. They didn't wait for the trial to conclude. They just said, "No, we're going to go ahead and hear this right away." So nobody got successfully sentenced under the federal law, but it did authorize prison terms. You can look it up. It's called the Flag Protection Act. I don't know how long the prison terms were, but everybody voted for it, right? I mean, I don't remember the exact votes, but it was something like 390 to 10 in the House, like one of those kind of laws. Because I mean, even if you support civil liberties, you're like a scared politician. You're like, I don't want to be the guy who votes for burning the American flag, right? Here's another thing they say in these cases, and this is relevant to all three of these cases so far, right? The Hustler magazine case, the Westboro Baptist Church funeral protest case, and the flag cases. They all make an argument along these lines. This is from U.S. versus Eichmann, which is the second flag case. If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. Right? Bedrock principle of the First Amendment. Government may not prohibit expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. What does that mean? I can read it again. Government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea offensive or disagreeable. Yeah.
I think it's a lot of saying that you can't silence free speech when it's obviously like controversial or when it's like inflicting some kind of trauma or pain on someone. Because I mean, you see it right now, even like with Trump with Twitter. There was a Twitter policy that was trying, that was saying that he wouldn't be banned as a world leader, and there was public outcry saying that he should, and his tweets are controversial. But even with that, like the strongest foundation is that it's meant to incite public discussion for democratic society. So it's needed, even if it's controversial or disagreeable.
So that's part of it for sure, right? I mean, sometimes the judges just point out, like, all of our cases, a lot of our most important free speech cases involve people saying something super controversial, because that's the ones where the disputes arise, right? If you just say something boring and regular, it doesn't usually turn into a free speech dispute. So that's part of it, right? Even very controversial speech is protected under the First Amendment. What else is it saying? Is there anything in this sentence? I'm going to read it again. Is there anything in this sentence about when and how speech can be punished? Like if you read between the lines. Government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea offensive or disagreeable. When can government punish expression?
When they see it as like offensive. I feel like they specifically said when society sees it, but like when the government sees it as unacceptable, then they can punish it.
So I don't think that's what he means here. I mean, because the government sees this one as offensive, right?
Yeah.
They do say society, but I think they mean society or government is acting because everybody in government and society, lots of us find these ideas offensive or disagreeable. Maurice?
This is just the way it's worded.
Yeah.
It's like breaking down the speech. It says that it cannot be restricted simply. No, what is it? It cannot prohibit expression because of that reason.
Yeah.
However, it doesn't just say cannot prohibit expression.
Right.
Like, it says that there's a stipulation, so that implies there is a situation
And so
in which.
what is that implied situation? Like, what would be another reason that government... so this is a start. This is a start. So government cannot prohibit your speech because it disagrees with the content of what you're expressing. They can't do that. That's what that sentence is saying. Which seems to imply that there might be some other situation where government can prohibit your speech. But what would it be?
When it incites violence or harm?
Maybe, yeah. So I'm trying to think of a good example to illustrate it. Do you have one? Right. So, like, if I am giving a speech to an angry mob, and I say, let's go, it's all the capitalist's fault, let's go, that rich guy over there, let's go storm into his house and take all his property and kill him, right? And the government is silencing my speech or punishing me for that speech, not because it disagrees with my advocacy of Marxism or whatever, but because of an immediate harm that is resulting, right? It's to prevent violence. Is potentially a different reason for prohibiting the speech than disagreement with the content of the ideas. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I was wondering, I guess, like, does freedom of speech end, like, when you start to take away the rights of other people?
Maybe, right? So there's a famous argument by John Stuart Mill about liberty in general, and one of the main examples that he talks about is the freedom of expression. And he argues that in a free society, everyone should have the right to do whatever they want up until it harms somebody else, right? So you don't have a right to punch somebody in the nose, right, because that harms somebody else. You do have a right to say anything you want in most circumstances, because that doesn't harm somebody else, although then there's some complicated cases that come up where saying something sometimes could be harmful. The key issue that the court is driving at here is that we should be particularly suspicious of government suppression of speech if it looks like that suppression is motivated by the content of the speech, right? Which not all suppression is, right? I will give you an example. City council passes a law that says no loud parades on residential streets in the middle of the night. I don't care why you're having a loud parade. I don't care if it's a Democrat parade or a Republican parade or a we made it to the Final Four parade or whatever. Not allowed. Right? That's not about the content of the speech. It applies to everybody saying anything. It is about the volume, location, and time of the speech, not about the content. Right? If you passed a law that said no Democratic parades on residential streets, that would be about the content, right? That would not be that is what work. That is work. They both restrict expression, but the second one is worse. Right? It is worse for government to restrict expression on the basis of its content. And so the phrase that the lawyers and judges usually use is just content neutrality is an important principle of the First Amendment, right? Regulations of speech. So sometimes we're going to have regulations of speech. They should be content neutral, right? If they are not content neutral, we are going to be particularly dubious of them, and we are going to look at them real closely, right? The examples of content neutral regulations that they often give, they sometimes refer to as time, place, and manner restrictions. Right? Restrictions on the time, place, and manner of your speech, which can sometimes be quite restrictive. Right? Oh, you can protest anything you want, but it's got to be in that free speech zone over there where nobody can see you. Right? I mean, that can be quite restrictive. So, well, let me say a word. So, on the handout has two long quotes from Snyder versus Phelps, right, which was near unanimous, but not quite unanimous. And the dissent, it was 8-1, and the dissent is from Justice Alito, right? And so this is not an ideological disagreement, right? Roberts and Alito are both conservatives. They were both appointed by George W. Bush, right? They agree on lots of constitutional issues, and they sharply disagree on this one, right? with Roberts and all the other justices saying, I know it's crazy, I know it's offensive, I know it's disagreeable, I know none of us like it, but the First Amendment protects your right to do this. And Alito's just like, you got to be kidding me. The First Amendment does not protect that. It does not have to protect that. It is intolerable. You're expanding the First Amendment too far if it allows people to engage in hateful, offensive protests outside of military funerals. No way do we have to tolerate that. Right? The government has eminently good reasons for trying to restrict that kind of expression. Right? But one vote. He's the only one. Right? Think about the so the cases we have talked about so far. So the Hustler case, which is unanimous. Snyder versus Phelps, which is 8-1. The flag burning cases are 5-4, but it's a weird vote breakdown, right? It's a mix of liberal and conservative justices on both sides. Justice Scalia is in the majority, along with Justice Brennan, who was one of the court's most liberal justices at the time. Scalia is one of the most conservative ones. They're both in the majority in the flag burning cases. So all of these decisions involve liberal and conservative justices together, protecting the freedom of speech. But that doesn't always happen, right? Take the Bong Hits for Jesus case. Bong Hits for Jesus, they rule against the First Amendment. That student holding that banner loses his case. The school was fine in suspending him for displaying that banner. And that one is 5-4, and it is the conservative justices in the majority and the 4 more liberal justices in dissent. And it seems like in that one, they revert to polarizing on ideological lines for some reason. This seems to be partly because of the drug-related content of the speech, and partly because of the student identity of the speaker. Remember the case of Tinker versus Des Moines from the Vietnam era, where the students got suspended for wearing black armbands to school in a eminently peaceful, clearly political protest that obviously regular grown-ups would for sure be allowed to do, right? But the school said, no, we got different rules in school. Anything like this is going to be disruptive, and we got to maintain discipline and order in the school. And the Supreme Court's like, no, what? It's not disruptive. They're just peacefully wearing black armbands to class to express a political message. You can't kick them out of school for that, right? Famous line from Tinker is that students do not shed their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate, right? Like maybe there's more limits on speech that are allowed in school than would be allowed out on the sidewalk, right? We've got to maintain order and protect the primary educational purpose of what we're all there for throughout the day. But still, students do have some First Amendment rights still. That one was not unanimous, and conservatives had long criticized it as going too far in protecting student speech rights. And Justice Clarence Thomas, in a concurring opinion in Morse versus Frederick, which is the Bong Hits for Jesus case, Justice Thomas said we should overturn Tinker. That was wrong. Students don't really have any First Amendment. They do shed them at the schoolhouse gate, right? Because school officials need to maintain order and discipline, and they get to impose all kinds of rules on students that they wouldn't be allowed to impose on adults walking around on the sidewalk, right? Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion. He didn't go that far. He didn't say we're going to overturn Tinker. He emphasized a lot the pro-drug nature of the speech, which I guess, I don't know what that banner is exactly advocating, but I guess it is supportive of illegal drug use, and it is offensive to some people's religion as well. But Chief Justice Roberts is like, schools have the zero tolerance policy on illegal drug use, right? You're not allowed to bring drugs into the school, and you'll get suspended automatically for that. And in order to try to maintain that zero tolerance policy, school officials have to have some leeway on clamping down on advocacy of illegal drug use, which I guess that banner could be taken to be. I'm concerned about the slippery slope on that one, right? Because can the student newspaper publish an editorial advocating for the legalization of marijuana? And if not, then I think we got some First Amendment troubles in this school, right? So the current court regularly protects the freedom of speech. The current court has heard lots of free speech cases. We just got a sample of them here, but there have been lots of free speech decisions from the court in recent years. It regularly protects the freedom of speech, but not always. And when it protects it, it is often like a ideologically mixed, bipartisan group of justices doing it. But when they don't protect it, sometimes they're reverting back to their kind of ideological, polarized divisions. Yeah.
How does that change in the private school system? Are there any cases where the court says, well, you decided to go to the private school, so yeah, they can, you could check your First Amendment at the door.
Right. I mean, the short answer, there is a longer, more complicated answer, but the short answer is that the First Amendment doesn't apply at all to private schools, right? Because the First Amendment is only a limit on government. Same with private employers, right? So if you're a boss, if you don't work for the government, you work for a private company, and your boss says you're not allowed to post any of that stuff on social media, and if you do, I'm going to fire you. Short answer is, first, you got nothing you can do. First Amendment doesn't apply. It only imposes limits on government. The longer, more complicated answer is there are a variety of, because there's so much federal funding and state funding that goes to private schools too, some of that funding comes with regulations, and so there might, if you find the law, if your private school suspends you for displaying a banner like that, and you find a lawyer, they might be able to come up with some arguments that this school, as a recipient of funding, shouldn't be allowed to violate the students' rights in this way, but it'd be a more complicated case to try to get anywhere with that. Let me give you another example. I didn't have an image to show you of this one, but it's a case from 2010. It's another example where the court does not protect freedom of speech and where the justices are sharply divided. It's called Holder, Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General at the time, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. And it's about a federal law that bans material support for terrorism, which has been a provision of federal law for some time that has said that it is illegal to knowingly provide material support or resources to a foreign terrorist organization. Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. After 9/11, when Congress enacted the Patriot Act, there was language in the Patriot Act that expanded the definition of material support for terrorism, which under the Patriot Act says, it defines material support for terrorism. So it says it's illegal to knowingly provide material support or resources to a foreign terrorist organization. And then it now defines material support or resources as, quote, any property, tangible or intangible, or service, including currency or monetary instruments or financial securities, financial services, lodging, training, expert advice or assistance, safe houses, false documentation or identification, communications equipment, facilities, weapons, lethal substances, explosives, personnel, and transportation, except for medicine or religious materials. And so that was a mouthful. But the way that new law, the Patriot Act, was interpreted by the Federal Justice Department in the wake of 9/11 was that it was illegal, federal crime, to provide any kind of advice or expertise of any sort to a foreign terrorist organization. You obviously can't give them bombs or money to buy bombs or advice on how to build a bomb, right? All of that is illegal. You also cannot advise them to stop bombing people, right? You cannot have any direct engagement at all. You can't give them legal advice, right? If they think that the government is illegally wiretapping them and they want your legal advice on what to do about it, you can't talk to them. If they want to petition the United Nations to send peacekeeping troops to their home countries, you can't advise them on how to do so. And we are not just talking about Al-Qaeda. The law applies to all individuals and organizations that have been designated as terrorists by the U.S. federal government. The groups at issue in this particular case, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, were the PK online. I pulled it up right before class. The current version is 1,100 pages. Right? 1,100 pages listing individuals and organizations designated as terrorists by the U.S. government. What if you get wrongly included on that list? You are not allowed, no U.S. person is allowed, lawyer, human rights advocate, anybody else, is allowed to consult with you on how you could get off of that list, right? No expert advice or consultation of any kind with foreign terrorists. So the logic of the law is clear, right? The government's trying to do something important here, but the expansive definition of material support, what is that noise? The expansive definition of material support gets challenged under the First Amendment, and they make their way to the Supreme Court, and they lose 5-4, right? And Chief Justice Roberts writes the majority opinion. I think he wrote the majority opinion in the Bongits for Jesus case too. He wrote the majority opinion in Snyder versus Phelps, which is a great expansive protection of the freedom of speech under the First Amendment. But in this case, he's like, no, the national security context, government's got a lot of leeway there. That's a very important government interest that outweighs the importance of freedom of speech in many situations. The folks who brought the suit were folks in the U.S., like human rights advocates in the U.S., who said that they were trying to engage with organizations like the PKK, which is like a Kurdish separatist organization in Turkey. They were trying to engage with them and encourage them to pursue peaceful means of seeking more Kurdish autonomy as opposed to violent means and the like. And they had to cease all that engagement because this law prohibits it. And the Supreme Court says the needs of national security outweigh this in this case. Yeah.
Did the court cite O'Brien in the case?
Did they cite O'Brien? So O'Brien is did they cite O'Brien? That's a good question. I don't remember. O'Brien is a really big case for this principle, among others. O'Brien is the case about burning your draft card, right? Selective Service Act says every male over the age of 18 has to register for the Selective Service, and should it be a time of war and a draft is instituted, then you have to have a card in your possession, and you may not deface or destroy it. And the main purpose of that law, the court says, is just the effective and efficient operation of the Selective Service system. You got to have the card so you know what your number is, and if you destroy your card, you don't have that official record anymore. This guy was at a anti-war speech who burnt his draft card publicly to express opposition to the war and the draft, so he was clearly trying to communicate something. But the Supreme Court said the government was not punishing him on the basis of the content of his expression. It was punishing him for burning the card, which it would have done if he had done it privately in his own home. They would have punished him for it if he had done it at a pro-war rally. I don't know why you would burn your draft card at a pro-war rally, but they would have punished him just the same, they say. And the court, in that opinion, in U.S. versus O'Brien, emphasizes this principle. The same kind of restriction on speech is like somebody gives the same speech and he's restricted by the government, but in two different scenarios, It is worse if the government is restricting it because the government objects to the content. It is worse if the government's arresting him because it was an anti-war rally, as opposed to just arresting everybody who burns the card.
So you're saying that he wasn't convicted because it was an anti-war expression, but just because he's not allowed to burn the card. So he's not allowed to burn the card in his own home?
Correct. That was the government's argument, and that was one of the things the court emphasized.
Why would you not be allowed to burn in your own home? But what if you wrote the number down?
Yeah, but so,
His favorite.
the Selective Service Act, I don't know the exact language, but it says nobody's allowed to deface or destroy or mutilate their card. I mean, there's rules about, like, money, U.S. currency, you're not allowed to.
I think it's because, like, it would be, like, inside, there were issues when, like, the draft was originally instituted where people were, like, violently against the draft. I think that was, like, symbolic of maybe inciting that type of thing.
Maybe so. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there were draft riots in the 19th century for sure. Yeah. So, what's the other connection with O'Brien? Is that what were you thinking about?
I was thinking about just the compelling government interest.
Yeah. So what they say in O'Brien is, ordinarily, a restriction on free speech has to be justified by a really high burden, but here, we're not restricting somebody's speech directly, right? We're just restricting, like, the behavior, that it's like conduct, not speech, that's being restricted directly. And the government has more leeway on that, so we got a slightly lower burden of proof in this case. But one of the things we're still going to look for is whether the restriction is content neutral or not. And in Holder, I don't remember if Roberts references O'Brien in Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, but the dissenters say this is clearly content-based, right? Like it's the government objects, obviously the government objects to terrorism, and the government objects to support for terrorism, and the government objects to support for terrorist organizations. But even if you are engaged in what would otherwise be peaceful, lawful conversation with members of one of these groups, right? The government is objecting to that because our policy under the Patriot Act is you shouldn't be engaging with these organizations at all in any fashion, and that's content-based. And so it's got to meet a high burden of proof, and the dissenters say we should strike that law down. Not that government can't ban material support for terrorism, it just can't ban it in such a way as to also apply to peaceful, otherwise lawful discussion of legal issues or human rights or whatever it is. Last other case that I just want to mention is about cross-burning. So the court has heard two cases about this issue. The one that's in the reading is called Virginia versus Black, which involved a Klan rally in Virginia in 1998, at which there were lots of racist speeches, culminating with the burning of a large cross at the end of the rally. And Virginia had a law that says it shall be unlawful for any person with the intent of intimidating any person to burn a cross on the property of another. It shall be unlawful for any person with the intent of intimidating any person to burn a cross on the property of another. And then there was a separate second sentence in the law that said, I don't know why this is in a separate sentence, if this was added at a different time, I don't know. But there's a separate sentence in the law that says, proof of cross-burning will itself be taken as prima facie evidence of intent to intimidate. Prima facie is a lawyer's term for that'll be our presumption. Like if you just prove that somebody burned a cross, our presumption is going to be he was trying to intimidate somebody, because that is usually what burning a cross is trying to do. It doesn't mean you can't rebut that. You could prove the opposite, but the initial assumption would be that burning a cross would be prima facie evidence of intent to discriminate. The Supreme Court upholds the law, mostly. It's one of these complicated cases where the justices can't all agree with each other, and they're divided up into multiple different opinions. But 6 of them say that Virginia can outlaw cross-burning if it wants. Right? you can't outlaw flag burning, right? That's an earlier case. You cannot outlaw flag burning. But this case, and the composition of the court has shifted a little bit, so that could be part of it. But they say you can outlaw cross burning. It is given our nation, and it's Justice Thomas who says this most clearly in a concurring opinion. Given our nation's history, right, the message that is conveyed by burning a cross in public is so hateful and threatening and violent that it's outside the protection of the First Amendment. Thomas says that most explicitly and clearly. He's like, this is a completely unprotected category, right? Completely unprotected category of speech, given its history. I know this is content-based, right? We're singling it out on the basis of its content, but it's a special thing. It's outside. The other justices don't quite go that far, and they're trying to draw some pretty fine lines here. And they say, what most of them say is the state can make it illegal if it wants. The state can make it illegal to burn a cross with intent to intimidate, because of the harms that one would be expected to follow from people burning a cross with the intent to intimidate. Right, in Virginia's history, it has often been a precursor to racist acts of violence, for example. But the state can't say that second sentence, right, that burning a cross is automatically prima facie evidence that you are intending to intimidate. Like, it can't be automatic. The state would have to actually prove that you burned the cross with the intent to intimidate, and then they could punish you. If you could prove, alternatively, that you were burning the cross for some other reason, not trying to intimidate anybody, then it would be protected speech, right? So that is drawing a pretty fine line there. On the one hand, I think Justice Thomas's view is not unreasonable, that given our nation's racial history, right, burning a cross is so distinctive, such a distinctive, like, public act, that you could make the case for treating it differently than other First Amendment issues. On the other hand, even given our history, you could make the case that, the protests outside the military funerals, burning the American flag, those are deeply hateful and offensive too. And if you think of it in slippery slope terms, like, why would we say the government can outlaw cross burning? Isn't that going to lead somebody to then come back and say, okay, but then flag burning, let's try that one again? Like, why? That's really offensive to many people too. So it's a tricky line to draw. Three of the justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, David Souter, and Anthony Kennedy, so 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, say Virginia can punish threats, right? That could be like, there's a lawyer's phrase, true threats, right? Virginia can publish true threats, like, I'm going to kill you. Like, that can be made illegal, right? That's okay. But Virginia cannot, consistently with the First Amendment, single out certain kind of threats and say these ones are punished and other threats are not, right? Like a racist threat by a Klan, the racist threat by the Klan via a cross burning, if you're treating that differently from other kinds of threats, that is not content neutral, and so the state can't do it. That's in dissent, right? That's Souter, Kennedy, and Ginsburg. Cross burnings, here's what they say. Cross burnings are virtually always intended to intimidate, but they are also virtually always intended to convey a message of white supremacy. As disagreeable as that message is, it is protected speech, as we said in Brandenburg, right? So, just to wrap it all, the current Supreme Court has regularly defended the freedom of speech, including some really controversial offensive examples of speech. Snyder versus Phelps, for example. However, there are still, in this time period, as in all previous time periods, certain kinds of speech that come up where the justices are just like, nope, that one goes too far. Whether it's cross burnings or material support for terrorist organizations or student advocacy of illegal drug use, the court still sometimes says that kind of speech can be silenced. That's all.